Well, hello, Arnold.
Hello, John.
Well, we're going to today talk through the history of St.Annes.
Yes.
And I think with you, we should start with the story of St.Annes Bank.
Oh, yes. Well, of course, St.Annes Bank is down on the beach, as you can imagine. And according to my son, a fisherman, he reckons that St.Annes stood for stone. And so it was a stone bank. It was a series of different sizes of stone. And where did these stones come from? Well, I believe that all those stones were put down there about 300 million years ago, during the Triassic period, when great big sheets of ice were flowing across this land, and as the sheets of ice carrying the stones in them met up with the salt water of the sea, then they melt and those stones drop there to form that St.Annes Bank. And you can imagine these great sheets of ice slowly coming across what was later on to be called the Fylde, resulted in that flat space that created the Fylde, which of course was named after the fields. The Fylde is always the fields. And so that formed what we think of is almost the boundary, the tide line, if you will, of the original formation of St.Annes, what was to become St.Annes.
Where was how far back do we go to get the name Fylde?
Oh, Fylde. Well, that's people, the various people who lived around here. They juggled about with names, and as you know, when you juggle with names, the dialects come in. So the early dialects would be saying, "Oh, you're talking about the Fyldes." Now, the Fyldes would be meaning the fields.
Yeah.
And so there you are. That's how it got its name, the Fylde. But before the Fylde name was there, if you go right back in history, all that land was covered in a forest. There was a mixture of mossland and forest, and these forests went right down to the water's edge. And those early settlers, to try and get to the coast, would have had a terrible job, because that land wasn't drained. That didn't come till much later, and so those early people who arrived on the coast would have had great difficulty actually getting to the coast.
How far back was the sea in those days?
Well, of course, we've only got these early map makers, like say in about 690, year 690, you've got Ptolemy. Peculiar spelling. It started with P something or other, but everyone said it was pronounced Ptolemy. And he was one of the earliest map makers. And when he drew the actual coastline off here, off what was to become St.Annes, the coastline was way out from where we are now.
Yeah.
It was what we would regard as the low point, when the tide goes really out and you've got a really long way to walk over the sands.
Yeah.
And that was the point where in 690, that's where the coast was.
Right.
And of course later on, during the period leading up, you got huge tidal surges. Sometimes people say there's a fault line in the Irish Sea, and every now and then this fault line creates a type of tsunami. Other people say we get a strong high tide coming in with the following wind.
1582 is...
1532, 1582's momentous time.
Right.
In like 1532 and thereabouts, we again had one of these huge tidal surges where the tide was so high and the wind so strong that it just came right across this land that we know of as St.Annes. And it knocked down the trees, it destroyed all the crops. The people living around here, what few there were, and there was only a few, it was ruinous for them.
Yeah.
Of course, the only thing they had to survive on was a bit of fish that they caught, possibly a few vegetables that they'd saved, and rescued a few animals. And around about that time, there was all sorts of shipwrecks. These were wonderful for the people living around here, the shipwrecks. There was one wreck off, right about that time, caught up in the storm, and it was carrying a cargo of peas. And all these peas were washed up on the beach, and the locals gathered up these peas. And for weeks afterwards, the diet was quite monotonous, all sorts of different sorts of peas. And that's where you get the formation of parched peas, which people that come from other parts of the country, they come to Blackpool to be served parched peas. So they say, we don't want them, they look horrible. But for the people of this area, those peas were a lifesaver. And whenever, you know, the people down in the south of England talk about a pea super, meaning a dense fog. For us, up here, a pea super was a lifesaver, dating all the way back to then.
Goodness me.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And the village of Cross Slack.
Oh, the Cross Slack. Well, of course, Cross Slack, that goes back over 300 years. You've got, now, if we had to consider that now, they were where the Old Links golf course is now. And it's in between Highbury Road and goes up Squire's Gate.
And did some of it go out to sea?
No, the bit that went out to sea was the village of Kilgrimmel.
Ah.
But Cross Slack, it started about 300 years ago. The people who lived around there were very dependent upon the sea for a living, and of course at that end, the northern end of that section of Cross Slack, on the beach there, were all the largest stones on the Stanner bank, and it's those large stones that they use for building their cottages. And so they built these, and of course they depended upon wrecks to get a bit of extra wood in, which are used for forming the roof structures, and then the various cereal crops and grasses for the roof. And these people, they'd have as many as 9 children. And they had to go up a rickety ladder up into the loft, and they all laid up there side by side, and there was always a fire going. So the best place to sleep up in a loft there was close to the chimney breast. You see, that kept them warm, and they always had a pig. If you had a pig, all of a sudden you developed a lot of extra friends, because they all came round and said, when are you going to kill this pig? You know, we're a bit hungry. Yeah. And they'd have a few chickens about, and they grew whatever they could. And one of the places very famous was Granny Fisher's cottage. Descendants of the Fishers go on for centuries round here.
Yeah.
They're mentioned in back in the year 1400. When you look through the people who lived around here, there was a fisher then. And then of course you've got the Gillets. Gillets had quite a sizable farm where Highbury Road was near the railway there, and that was Gillet's farm. Marvellous, beautiful farm, big farm, and they were very successful farmers. And of course, there you are, Cross Slack. What really made them was the railway coming through in about 1848, 1850. The single track came through, and there wasn't the Highbury Road Bridge then. Highbury Road was actually called Twiggy Lane then. And they'd have sort of just a track going across the railway there. And if they had to, if the Cross Slack people wanted to send their cockles, because they were always raking the cockles up, send the cockles off all over the country, they'd just wave to the engine driver, he would stop, and they'd load the cockles on there. Then the train would go up to Lytham, to where the existing station is now. Then it will be carted over to the other railway station, which is in Station Road.
They weren't joined then?
Oh no! No, you see, the railway first of all came to Lytham about 1846, something like that. And it stopped at Lytham. Right. This really upset the squire of Lytham. He said, why didn't you continue on to Blackpool? Oh, they said, we can't afford to do that. And he pestered and they wouldn't agree to it. So he said, oh, well, in that case, I'll build my own single track line. So he started it where the present railway station is. He built with all his gang of helpers, he built a single track line from Lytham through to what is now Blackpool.
Goodness.
And to get this engine onto that track, they had to bring this steam engine, a little steam engine, across the fields, keep putting sections of railway sleepers and lines down, and gradually they hauled it and got it onto the single track, which came through to Cross Slack and onto what was to become Blackpool, you see.
Really?
Yes.
Kilgrimmel, was this a separate place?
Oh, yes. Well, the Kilgrimmel, going back to the 1500s and before then, the area was inhabited by the Benedictine monks. And they acquired the lands way back, you know, around about 1200, 1100, and they had been given the lands of Lytham, and this area we're talking about was regarded as Lytham West. And they had a small priory at Lytham, round the back of where Lytham Hall is now. And they, as part of their religious order, they would go out and create cells. And so they created a cell with a few of them out there, what we would regard as out on the beach now. But when this huge storm came along, it swept away their cell. And there was a stone where the Kilgrimmel cross was, and the step that formed Granny Fisher's footstep going into her place, the archaeologists always reckon that was the base stone for the Kilgrimmel cross. They'd hauled it over to build this little cottage of hers. But of course, Granny Fisher wouldn't agree to all these archaeologists and things going and dragging her doorstep away. Not while she was living there anyway. And there was all sorts of interesting lumps of stone all the way around round there, they had their own well. Loads of people around here had their own well. When they left those cross-slap cottages, all these useful stones, which would have meant a huge story to the archaeologist, were all tipped down this well and filled in as part of the Old Rings golf course. And there were a series, there was about 5 or 6 of these old cobbled cottages. And people walking from Lytham to Blackpool and back, they always made a point of calling in at the last cobbled cottage near to Squire's Gate, because the people in there brewed their own beer, wonderful beer. And so, you know, a estate agent for Clifton, who had to go around collecting the rents, he was never away from this place. He thought the beer was so wonderful, he'd pick up any excuse, so he'd get on his horse and gallop off down to Cross Slack. And so the cottage is named after Cross. That was named after the Cross of Kilgrimmel. Really? And so the Slack bit, that was a name referred to Slack water. And down where is now Kilgrimmel Gardens, you know, that estate, you'll see that there's as you go off Clifton Drive into the Kilgrimmel Gardens estate, you sort of go downhill towards the railway, and there was always a lake there, a shallow lake, and in the winter that lake would freeze over, and it was wonderful for skating on.
There was something found under a tree in next to the Vic.
Yes, that was Beauclerk Garden.
Yes.
And that was, well, Ted Jeffrey, who lives at Ye Retreat in Church Road, his father worked for the council, and he was working on the gardens of digging round the base of this tree. And his spade hit a box. Clunk, what's all this? So he dug this box up, and it was full of all these old coins. And of course, being a very honest gentleman, he handed all these coins in as treasure trove, and he was duly rewarded for all his efforts. So some of those coins will be on display in the Preston Library, Preston Records Office, and you can go in there and inquire about that. But over the ages, we've got so many skirmishes going on around here. You know, the finest scourges, of course, were round about the period 1640 odd, the Restoration, just after King Henry VIII and all that troubles, where religion changed, and the king wanted us to have the Church of England, or the Protestant religion, and get rid of the Catholic religion. Well, of course, if you've been involved in skirmishes and raiding people's houses and looting, some of these army people on either side would end up with loot, bounty of what they found. Well, they couldn't go wandering around fighting wars carrying a whole load of treasure. So they'd find some marking point, like a tree, like that one in Beauclerk Garden, to bury the treasure. And that's how those treasures came about. All over the north of England, they came across treasures. In fact, getting back to the Cross Slack and the Gillett's farm, Kathleen Eyre, the late historian, she confided in me that his farmhouse, beautiful farmhouse, she wanted that to be preserved as a museum, but she couldn't come up with the funds. And she was telling me that when they knocked that farmhouse down, in the basement, in the foundations of the barn, builders were clearing it, ready for building houses there, they found some more gold coins. Well, the Gillets would have got that off one of the wrecks that came ashore. But they couldn't suddenly go out, because everybody knew the Gillett family, and if they went out and bought a new horse and a new car, they'd all get onto them and say, hey, where did you get the money from to buy that? So they buried the coins until they could find a good reason and a way of spending the money which wouldn't arouse the suspicion of their neighbours. And all the neighbours round there, you'd go round to their houses and they'd tell you all sorts of stories. And Highbury Road, I was telling you about Highbury Road, well, that used to be called Twiggy Lane. And the reason it got called Twiggy Lane was on May Day, a very important date in the early calendar. In these little low cottages, the local lads would climb up on the thatch and then stick a twig in the chimney pot. And then in the morning you'd come out to find out what your neighbours thought of you. And if someone had stuck a briar twig in your chimney pot, you'd look up and say, they think I'm a liar. You see, the liar rhyming with the briar. And so you've got all these different branches and twigs that all the local people could give a name to. Later on, my grandfather, who had an ironmonger's shop in St. Albans Road, he used to tell me stories. He said after it being Twiggy Lane, they were going to call it Balls Lane. And that was so offensive to people living round about. They said, oh, that's a very rude name. So it ended up being called Highbury Road. Yes, Twiggy Lane got its name. It was an unmade cart track, really, running down to the beach, and access to Cross Slack, used a lot by the estate workers for Clifton, because he took thousands of tons of those stones from Stanner Bank. For instance, all the way around his estate, when you go down Church Road, Lytham, you see those cobblestone walls.
Yes.
Those are the longest cobblestone walls in Europe. And if any of his tenants got behind with the rent, or they were in a bit of hardship because of a poor harvest, he'd say, right, all right, I'm going to give you a job. You're going to start building the wall around my estate. And so the horse and carts would go along Twiggy Lane. There wasn't that bridge there then. They'd cut straight across, go straight onto the beach, and there you got the largest stones for the stone walls.
And where were they before the sand dunes?
In front of the sand dunes weren't there.
Really?
In those, well, in the very early days, the sand dunes weren't there in 1532.
Right.
It was only after all these inundations of the sea and the sea coming in and destroying the forests, and in particular the oak trees.
Yes.
Now, when you come to sort of like 1583, when Queen Elizabeth I came on the throne, she found that if oak trees were being demolished or destroyed, that was affecting her navy. She had the best navy in the world, Queen Elizabeth I. And of course, a lot of her navy, they were attacking the Spanish boats, weren't they? Laden with treasures. And this is added into the royal coffers. And so she said, we mustn't let this happen again. How can we protect the land from the inroads of the sea? And her advisors said, marram grass. She said, what do you mean, marram grass? Oh, they said, if you plant marram grass on the coast, it'll catch the grains of sand as they're blowing, and then that will form sand dunes. The barren grass has very deep roots, so you'll end up with a row of sand dunes, and that will give you protection against the inroads of the sea.
Yeah.
She said, get it done. So straight away, they planted the marram grass, and then you've got the range of sand dunes that we see now. So high, and now you have to bear in mind 90% of the sand dunes in Lancashire are actually in St.Annes. If you look across the water to Southport, that's Sefton, of course.
Yeah.
But 90%.
Right.
And then she brought out a law. She said, on no account must the residents round here go and start pulling up the marram grass, because the people across Slack thought, oh, look at all that long grass, that'll do very nicely for our thatch. But they weren't allowed to do that. And then, in addition to help to keep people off the sand dunes, she also planted star grass, this grass with hard points to them. Some people call it line grass. Well, if you wandered in amongst that, it was uncomfortable. And then all sorts of other plants came along. Bushes with needles and wild orchids grew there. It was really a marvellous place, and created this barrier to keep. And then after that, then you've got the farmers, like where the airport is now, halfway along to the halfway house going across where the airport, you had farms. Like the biggest farm was Cartmell's farm. He had acres and acres of cereal crops growing, and those cereal crops, it's amazing, he got them to grow in sandy conditions, but those cereal crops caught the blowing sands, and the level of the land rose over the centuries. The blowing sands meant that there you are, that was the area that had been developed by the blowing sands, lifting the level of the land all the way around here. And when Squire Clifton's family, the Clifton family arrived here about 600 and something, when they saw all the level of the land rising, then grass grew, it formed common land for people to graze their animals on. You got an area like Headroom Gate. People coming along Headroom Gate Lane came to a barrier where beyond there, that was common land, where people living around here with cows, they could put the cows there and let the cows and horses graze free of charge around there. But I'm skipping ahead too far at this point.
Rabbit Warren.
Oh, well, of course, there I mentioned Queen Elizabeth I and the sand dunes, creating those sand dunes, and the next thing to happen was the sand dunes were populated by the rabbits. You had the fields, but the safest place for the rabbits to run off to was running to the sand dunes. Easy to make a rabbit burrow. Yeah. And those sand dunes stretch all the way up from Squire's Gate up to, where the White Church is now. Yeah. In fact, that building across the road from the White Church, it was a one time a big huge red house made of Accrington brick, and they call that the Warren. And so Squire Clifton saw the commercial potential there. Because there were so many rabbits, he would send his men off to put nets over the burrows, and he'd send the ferrets down, the horses, the dogs, to panic the rabbits. And as the rabbits came out of the burrows, he caught the rabbits, and in 1860 it's recorded that he caught 10,000 rabbits. And what did he do with them? He had them skinned, and all the rabbit fur went off to Stockport, where the hat makers are. And of course all the best quality hats were made at Stockport, and they did a process with rabbit fur, compressed them, steamed it, and that turned it into a felt, and then the felt was steamed and shaped into hats. And of course the meat, that was a saleable commodity, rabbit meat. And so that went on, must have gone on for quite a few hundred years. What a good earner!
Yeah.
Right on his doorstep. And any of the locals, like those people living in Cross, like if they were caught catching a rabbit and eating a rabbit, they were in trouble.
Oh.
Such was the feudal system. But nonetheless, I'm sure on the quiet, a few rabbits did end up in the pot.
Yeah. Well, when did we end the feudal system and go on from there?
Well, yes, you had boundary disputes, of course. We keep going back to 1532 and a bit later on than that. There was boundary disputes. The boundary was between the manor of Lytham and the manor of Leighton, for example, was that ditch alongside Division Lane. The prior of the Benedictine order, he called that Prior's Ditch.
Yeah.
But there was a really rough lot living over in Leighton called the Butler family. And they disputed this boundary. They said, oh, no, our land stretches over on what you claim to be Lytham's side. So they'd come over and they'd pinch cattle. They even came over on one occasion and knocked a house down. And there's all sorts of legal disputes with this, with the monks, Benedictine monks and this Butler family. And it went to court. Court held it, Preston, and in the end the court ended up in favour of the Benedictine monks. But by that time, with boundary disputes, this prior, he had a flipping nervous breakdown. He said, I can't stand this any longer. And he went back to his base in Durham, in Northumberland. But by this time, we'd got the disputes going on between the parliamentarians and the Cromwellian people coming backwards and forwards, and there were fighting going on there. But the feudal system, which was your original question, was when the Clifton family came in, and gradually they saw the potential of the area which was to be known later on as St.Annes. They could see the land rising, and they realised that if they put drainage in, they could reclaim this land. Yeah. So they put the drainage in, modelled on what was going on at Southport, brought the engineers in from Southport and said, how do we drain this land? Oh, they said, dig a few dikes and put sluice gates in. And then he reclaimed such a huge area of land around St.Annes that he then started dividing it up and renting it off to farmers. That increased his income. And of course, it didn't end up there. When the farmers started growing their crops, he had something like 10% of what they got from the crops. And they had to take all their cereal crops off to Lytham Windmill to Mr. Cookson to have that turn into flour. And of course the hay would do as feed for the animals. So gradually, with dividing the land up into plots, the feudal system gradually started coming to an end. But a lot of the old Lytham people would still say we're living in flipping feudal time, because he had this sort of ground rent thing, which to a large extent is still going on around here, whereby if you wanted to build a house, you acquired a plot of land. But the land didn't belong to you. The land belonged to the ground landlord, and you had to pay a rent for that land. And so you took out, today it's a leasehold of 999 years. But then, in the areas like Lytham and round here, they only gave you a lease of 45 years. Well, of course, if you're going to build a house, and you know that you're going to lose your house after 45 years, you're going to build an absolute rubbish house.
Yeah.
So they just built houses of mud and straw and a bit of thatch. Nothing of any value. And it wasn't until Squire Clifton saw the error of the ways and started giving longer ground leases that the quality of the houses went up. And there you see the gradual end of the so-called feudal system. Yeah.
Good. Well, I think we've covered it today. We've got a nice beginning to St.Annes.
Yes, thank you.
Oh.
Yes.